Hey everyone, before we begin, I actually have a Steam key giveaway for the PC port of The Last of Us Part 2. But I'm not just gonna randomly pick someone, you'll have to earn it with a little quest, and here's how. In today's video, you'll find the first half of the key. I've spread the first 7 characters throughout this video. They will pop up in the top right corner for a few seconds each, so make sure to write them down. The second half of the key, that's 8 more characters, will be revealed the same way in my next video, so be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, just in case you want to be the first to grab the game. Just a heads up, the key has 15 characters in total, split into 3 groups of 5, separated by dashes. And remember, only the fastest viewer to enter the full key on Steam will actually get the game. Alright, the hunt is on. A few weeks ago, I've acquired an old GTX 1080 gaming laptop beast from 2017 and gave it a proper re-review. You can check that out afterwards if you're interested, but I really wanted to further test the now almost 9-year-old GTX 1080 mobile in a few more games, and that's actually what we're going to do today. All games have been recorded via a capture card on a desktop PC, so there was no performance loss. Keep in mind that the used i7 8700K CPU in this laptop is actually a desktop CPU, which is a bit uncommon, but this way I was able to keep the CPU bottleneck as small as possible for the 1080 mobile, but it also means on more regular laptops with mobile CPUs, the experience might not always be identical to what you'll see today. And you know what? Thanks to Eniba, buying so many games to actually just benchmark and test them is much more affordable for me. Today's video is brought to you by Eniba. You want really cheap games and you're tired of waiting for the next big sale just to grab your favorite game? Yeah, same here. That's why I've personally been using Eniba for years now and they've never let me down. It's a massive online marketplace where you can get legit game keys, software licenses and gift cards for way less than you'd pay in the official stores. We're talking Steam, Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo and more. It's all there. You just pick your platform, check out the low prices and get an instant delivery of your keys. No more FOMO, no more waiting for Black Friday or Steam sales. Whether you're looking for that one game everyone's talking about or you just need a cheap Xbox Game Pass subscription, Eniba's got you covered. And it's all digital, super fast and super simple with, in my opinion, the best user experience of all key shops. So next time you're about to overpay, maybe just don't? Check out Eniba instead today via my links in the description. Alan Wake 2 was practically unplayable on GTX 1080 and 1080 Ti cards when it was launched due to missing hardware features, but that has somewhat improved a year later. Though the GTX 1080 mobile is really pushed to its limits here. I tested 1080p with medium settings and FSR on quality, which resulted in average FPS of around 42 to 47, and the 1% lows were, depending on the scenario, acceptable to, well, not great. Sure, it runs better than it did a few months ago, but it's still far from good. This is simply due to the age of the GPU, which isn't optimized for this game and has to compensate for missing hardware with software solutions. In forest scenarios, FPS can even drop to around 40. Assassin's Creed Shadows is one of the newest games around as of the making of this video, and it's a tough nut to run really. I mean, it's not badly optimized in terms of stability, frame times are pretty good and there's little to no stuttering. But the average FPS at 1080p and medium settings with FSR balanced are disappointing with somewhat between 45 and 50 on average, though splendid 1% lows of around 38 to 40. And that frame time graph is just unusually flat. A very rare sight these days. Still, for what we get graphically, I am disappointed to be honest. But that's not the GTX 1080 mobile's fault really. For Apex Legends I was using 1080p with the lowest settings except for the texture size, which was at 4GB to satisfy more sophisticated players amongst you. That was resulting in 141 FPS on average, which is almost the full standard FPS cap the game comes with if not deactivated manually. The 1% lows have been fine as well with 86 FPS on average. Perfectly playable, would actually even make sense here to use a 120 or 144Hz 1080p monitor. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora still looks pretty good even on medium settings with FSR set to balanced. It actually ran fairly okay with an average of around 58 FPS and 1% lows of 35 FPS. I think with even lower settings you could probably achieve a stable 60 FPS. Here the GPU was actually fully utilized, pulling around 160 to 170 watts and running very hot at around 90 degrees Celsius. This caused some throttling of its core clock due to the heat. The entire laptop was drawing around 300 watts from the wall and got really loud. However, the i7-8700K managed to maintain its all-core turbo of 4.3 GHz consistently. Not bad. Small note, one of the previous owners undervolted the CPU by 100 mV via the BIOS, which probably helps a lot in keeping temperatures down and maintaining the boost. All in all, definitely playable. For a 7-year-old laptop, that's actually a pretty solid performance. Surprisingly, the benchmarking tool of Black Myth Wukong worked flawlessly. I tested 1080p at medium settings with frame generation enabled and FSR at 75% scaling, which resulted in a solid 77 FPS on average, and even the 1% lows were really good at 64 FPS. I didn't expect that. However, when I ran it at native resolution without FSR and without frame generation, the frame rate dropped to an average of around 36 FPS, so that's not a really good base to start with for frame generation. The GTX 1080 runs pretty hot at around 80 to 85 degrees Celsius, while the CPU stays relatively cool at around 55 to 64 degrees Celsius. But then again, this isn't a CPU heavy game really. I also tested Remedy's control at 1080p with medium settings and saw a very good 79 FPS on average and good 1% lows with around 63. So I'm pretty sure high settings would be okay here as well. I mean, we would not be able to make use of DLSS or ray tracing here, but the first one is not needed and the game still looks fine without the second. So I'd say let's just jump to the next game instead, shall we? For CS2, I actually tested 1080p at low settings without FSR. This resulted in around 163 FPS on average in a deathmatch on Dust 2 with 1% lows of 66 FPS. The latter is pretty common in CS2 and the game was still absolutely smooth, just not at over 200 or 300 FPS like on many modern gaming laptops. And once more, both the GPU and CPU were not fully utilized. But then again, CS2 isn't exactly the most demanding game out there either. I tested Diablo 4 with high settings and FSR on quality in both 1080p and 1440p. At 1080p, that resulted in 116 FPS on average with 1% lows of 73. Very playable and mostly good frame times. Though at 1440p, I now saw only 71 FPS on average, with a bit more stuttery 1% lows of now only 37, while it's still absolutely playable that way of course. Even without FSR, high settings should be playable just fine at 1440p. That's nice. For F1 24, I was using the integrated benchmark and the Bahrain map with high settings at 1440p and FSR on quality. While the frame time graph looked a bit weird, like short-haired carpet, the 1% lows have been okay with 54 FPS and the average was around 82 FPS. So despite the higher settings and resolution, playable just fine really on that now almost 9-year-old mobile GPU. I also tested FC25 both at 1080p and 1440p with high settings, and in both cases that would work just fine. 76 FPS on average with 1% lows of 37 at 1080p, while the reason for the rather bad 1% lows are actually just the cutscenes after goals etc. would be better otherwise. And at 1440p, still very playable 65 FPS on average, and the 1% lows once more have been affected by the cutscenes and would be just fine otherwise. So a round of soccer or football, depending on where you're from, is just perfectly doable with the GTX 1080 mobile. And finally, a quick round of Fortnite at 1080p and again medium settings with TSR at 75% in DirectX 12 mode. The game ran well at an average of 142 FPS and still looked quite decent, if you like the art style that is. The 1% lows were at 73, which isn't perfect, but that's because it was my first match played. Meaning stuttering usually improves a bit over time. It felt really good, definitely playable. I think if you're fine with 120 FPS, you could even disable upscaling and get a sharper image. Here it's noticeable that the CPU is highly utilized. It gets quite warm and the i7-8700K might even be bottlenecking the GTX 1080 a little bit at higher FPS. Spoiler up front, Forza Horizon 5 ran absolutely perfect at 1080p with ultra settings and no upscaling. I saw a decent average of 88 FPS with 1% lows of 68. So for the 75Hz monitor in this particular laptop, that would be more than enough. And for 90 or 120Hz monitors, one could surely use high or medium settings instead to get a few more FPS. But overall, a really smooth experience. But to be honest, I didn't expect anything else here. It's not the newest game, but it wasn't released until 4 years after the GTX 1080 Mobile was, so I wanted to include it today. I'm not sure what was going on with the frame time graph of Genshin Impact. I tested the game with its highest possible settings at 1080p, and the GTX 1080 was absolutely bored with around 40%, though the frame times seemed quite horrible. I don't know if you can see that, but it didn't seem to translate to the actual gameplay, so probably a sensor or reading issue here. However, that game is no real match for the GTX 1080 Mobile. Helldivers 2 worked more or less flawlessly at 1080p native without any resolution scaling and medium settings. A pretty good 58 FPS on average, not a stable 60 but pretty close, and as you can see the frame times were amazing even in firefights. I mean, here it depends a bit on the planet type and how much action is going on, but in any case I did have some headroom left after all, as low settings or upscaling are still an option if everything else goes to, hell. Next up was Hogwarts Legacy. I tested it at 1080p with medium settings and FSR set to quality. That resulted in an average of 68 FPS. The frame times, as is often the case on all the systems with this game, weren't quite optimal, and the 1% lows were only at 28 FPS. This often happens in Hogwarts Legacy when entering new areas for the first time, turning around quickly or moving rapidly. It stutters a bit initially but gets somewhat better over time. Overall, it was still playable, though far from perfect. Also take note on the GPU and CPU utilization, both of which were quite low, meaning the game doesn't seem to be running quite as it should on the system. Well, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle unfortunately doesn't run at all because the game requires a GPU with ray tracing capabilities, so you can actually play it on modernized GPUs but not on the GTX 1080. This game has just been released a few weeks back, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and guys, this game runs buttery smooth on this laptop. I am impressed, is really well optimized. At Full HD with high settings and FSR set to quality, I was getting an average of between 60 and 90 FPS, depending on where I was located. I'm sure they'll optimize it even a bit further, but as it stands, it really runs really well. Super smooth, virtually no stutters, and a perfectly flat frame time graph. That's honestly an exception, because nowadays games usually aren't this well optimized at launch. Manor Lords did have some weird frame timing issue at 1080p and high settings. You can see constant and rhythmic micro stutters. I don't know what was going on here. It was noticeable while playing the game, though I think you could still do it considering the genre. But maybe that's something that should and could be fixed somehow. I mean, could be the VRAM, despite it saying it only used 7.3 GB instead of the 8 GB we actually do have. And then again, it's a one-man project which is still early access, and it's Unreal Engine 5 in the end, which is not optimal performance-wise in general, I also gave Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 a fair chance with medium settings and 1080p plus FSR on quality. That resulted in around 41 FPS on average flying over New York City, with pretty bare 1% lows of only 4, caused by some sporadic but pretty heavy micro freezes here and there. Could be fixed after a while of flying around, giving the game a chance to load all the shaders etc, but I wanted to mention it nonetheless. And however, as you might have noticed, the GPU usage was not fully maximized, so there might be a CPU or RAM speed or maybe engine bottleneck instead. It's not RAM or VRAM size, but perhaps the fact that we're only having like 6 real, older and therefore slower cores here. I think current efficiency cores in recent mobile CPUs are more or less comparable to the 6 cores we actually have here. Well, what can I say about the integrated benchmark of Monster Hunter Wilds? It kinda sucks, right? Probably one of the worst running games I've ever tested. At 1080p and low settings with FSR on quality, that resulted in an average of only 29 FPS and bad 1% lows of only 13. I mean, it could be the benchmark, but even simple game scenes only ran with 22 to 32 FPS or so. Actually not really playable and unless you like pain. A lot of pain. Please let me know in the comments if the actual game runs any better than this horrible 6 minutes long benchmark. I was also using the integrated benchmark tool for Rainbow Six Siege, which ran a lot better at 1080p with high settings and 100% resolution scaling. 159 on average, and the 1% lows have been around 75 FPS. They haven't been optimal, but it seems as if this scene was causing that, but I didn't really notice any stuttering here, so maybe we can ignore that and assume it's running just fine really. I was actually using frame generation with FSR at medium settings and a resolution of 1080p for Starfield, which seemed to work just perfectly fine with averages between 60 and around 90 FPS most of the time, highly depending on the planet or if you're flying in space, etc. Some minor stuttering happened in the capital, but other than that the frame times seemed fine. And frame generation seemed okay really, especially with 70 FPS or more, while I have to admit the game already looks a bit blurry at 1080p with FSR enabled. Kudos to Naughty Dog for the PC port of The Last of Us 2, or to be precise, that was done by a company called Nixxes. And I think they did a fabulous job since it seems to run so much better than Part 1 did back at its release. At 1080p with medium settings and FSR on quality, I saw enough FPS to actually activate frame generation, and that then resulted in mostly over 100 FPS on average, up to over 120 in some cutscenes, and the 1% low seemed to be fine except for some stuttering that occurred in some cutscenes, but I think this game would run perfectly fine on this now almost 9-year-old mobile GPU. Now the GTX 1080 Mobile still manages to play most recent AAA games in a way that can be considered fun. The biggest problem is missing compatibility for games like Indiana Jones or Call of Duty 6 Black Ops, and the lack of DLSS. But here FSR really comes to the rescue. We most likely won't get the much better FSR 4 here though. Still, in some cases that saves the day nonetheless. Again, in this laptop, the rather fast desktop CPU did help for sure as well, but that's the price you'll have to pay with laptops, especially with high-end GPUs. The CPU can and will become a problem at some point. In fact, I think for this Clevo/XMG laptop, we could actually install an Intel Core i9 9900K, which could further improve the experience by quite a bit. If you've enjoyed today's video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, especially if you want to grab that The Last of Us 2 Steam key. Check the beginning of the video if you missed on how to do that. And that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and tschüss.